Today's episode of Written in Stone is brought to you by RAB. The mountains are our meeting place. And tension climbing, mastery over success. December 1983. Families across Europe are sitting in their homes, eager to see a new critically acclaimed film, La Vie au bout des doigts, Life by the Fingertips, which is making its television debut. The film opens on a close-up of hands dipping into a chalk bag and then rubbing the chalk in, taking care to coat the backs and sides of the fingers. A man's voice, speaking French, is explaining what the chalk is for. Over the gentle sounds of the ocean lapping at the shore and the 8-bit beeps and boops of a Kraftwerk song called The Robots from their fittingly titled album, The Man Machine, we get our first full view of the speaker. Tanned and muscular with his long blonde hair tied down with a yellow headband, he's wearing only short shorts and is traversing a wall of what appear to be limestone jugs just above the water. His movements are fluid, as much dance as climbing, filled with a certain carefree panache. Not obvious to the non-climbing audience at home is that he's really hamming it up, bat hanging from jugs and dangling one-handed while casually chalking. The climber is Patrick Edlinger, and he is, at this very moment, becoming one of the most famous men in France. And it's easy to see why. He has rock star good looks, he's living with a certain freedom that seems unattainable to the average person. And then there's the nude scene. Now, I'm sure most French people were fairly blasé about this, but I have to wonder if, when 8 minutes into the film, beautiful 22-year-old Patrick Edlinger is waking up in his van, brewing his tea, and explaining that sometimes he takes a month off of climbing to just party, he's not always training like an animal. And he then stands and the blankets fall away, leaving it all hanging out, literally. Did husbands across France jump to cover the eyes of their wives? Did they themselves look away? I just have to wonder. But we aren't there yet. Right now, just a few minutes in, he's still traversing and waxing poetic about this lifestyle and intuition and instinct and balance. And all the while, he's climbing above a crashing and ever more turbulent sea that threatens to pull him in. But he's lost in his own world, weaving between light and shadow. And honestly, there's no better metaphor for this life at the fingertips of Patrick Edlinger. I'm Chris Hampton. You're listening to Written in Stone, climbing's most important ascents. This is Season 2, the 1980s. 1, 2. Raised in Toulon, a city in the south of France surrounded by limestone, climbing was a natural outdoor activity for young Patrick Edlinger. His father was convinced that he had a talent for climbing, and at 13 years old tried to enroll him in the French Alpine Club. But in the early 70s, there was an age limit. So instead, the teenage Edlinger fell in with a spirited group of other young blue-collar climbers who were frequenting the local crags. One of these climbers, nicknamed Kiki, took the eager young climber to the Verdon to do the Red Wall, then an aid climb that required a bivvy in a hammock on the wall. Waking up that morning with nothing but air and a vertical wall stretching beneath him all the way to the turquoise ribbon of the Verdon River, Patrick was fully hooked. And so, in the time-honored tradition of teenagers who find their calling, whether that's a rock band or rock climbing, his studies at school were replaced by mountaineering magazines hid in his textbooks. His parents made a deal with him that if he graduated, they would provide him an allowance that would give him time to climb so that he might become a guide. And that was all the motivation he needed. He finished school near the top of his class. After school, he immersed himself in climbing, frequently visiting the nearby crags that would soon become famous: Semailly, Verdon, Quatre Oro. He flew to the US for a trip up both Half Dome and El Cap, but not everyone had the nearly unlimited time and boundless energy that he had. Partners were sometimes hard to find. That is, until he was introduced to a like-minded climber from Nice, Patrick Berhault. 3 years older, intensely dedicated, and already an accomplished climber, Patrick Berhault was the perfect partner. The two became like brothers, training and climbing together, always trying to outdo the other. Neither had a driver's permit, but Patrick Berhault had a Peugeot, so what difference did that piece of paper make anyway? They drove from crag to crag, objective to objective, and by the beginning of the 80s, were making a name for themselves with a string of impressive winter ascents in the Alps. In 1980, the older Patrick managed to make the first free ascent of one of the most famous projects in the country, Piscinabule, a 400-meter, 12-pitch outing in the Verdon that came in at 12C, or 7B+, at a time when 12D, 7C, was the hardest grade in the country. Edlinger would follow in his footsteps a month later. Shortly after, the third ascent would go to John Backer, widely considered to be the best climber in the world. He would call it 12+, cementing the status of the two Patricks. But Patrick Berhault was increasingly drawn to the mountains, the wild remoteness, the giant unclimbed faces and ridges, the playground of his heroes. Patrick Edlinger, however, was growing less and less interested in the snow and ice. He enjoyed the sunshine and a nice breeze, climbing on dry rock in just his shorts, shoes, and a headband to hold back the golden locks. Their paths were diverging. In 1982, Patrick Berhault was approached about making a film. And the filmmaker had been watching the climbers, and it was clear to him that this man was the superior climber of the group. However, Patrick Berhault didn't think of himself as much of a showman. Instead, he was eager to escape into the mountains. "My friend, however," he suggested to the director, "would be willing, and he'd be great." Maybe that vote of confidence was all Edlinger needed. From here, he skyrocketed. Fame, women, there was that nude scene after all, and his climbing. It skyrocketed as well. The film, Life by the Fingertips, spends most of its time watching Patrick flow effortlessly, all free solo, over the roots of Buttes, a pocketed crag destined to become the place to be in just a few years. His narration tells of the lifestyle, the essential nature of climbing, the freedom. And it captured the imagination of the public, playing in 25 countries and making $25 million despite a budget of only $20,000. Patrick Edlinger was a rock star. But of course, there was skepticism from the core of the French climbing community. They knew that he was hamming it up. But that same year, 1982, at that same crag, Buttes, Edlinger roped up beneath Captain Crochet, a 7B+ or 12C, and fired it first try. It was the first on-site of that grade in the world. Not long after, he tied in under Le Polka des Ringards, the polka of the nerds, read the sequences perfectly, and in his trademark smooth and flowing style, managed the world's first on-site of a 7C, or 12D. At the time, the hardest route in France was just one notch harder, 13A, 7C+, and it had only been climbed one time. This was undeniable. Clearly, the man known now as Le Blond was ratcheting things up to a new level. Patrick Edlinger was more than just a rock star. He was the rock star. In 1981, in the attic of a small terraced house in Sheffield, the center of the climbing community in the UK, Rab Carrington made the first sleeping bag to bear his name. More than 40 years later, the people at Rab are still crafting rugged, high-performance clothing and equipment for the mountains, the kind of gear that becomes a staple in your kit that you'd rather repair than replace. Rab are on a journey to reduce the impact of their business and expand access to the outdoors. They're committed to preserving our mountain playgrounds for future generations because they know that the mountains are our meeting place. When the film Life by the Fingertips took off the way that it did, LeBlanc got to thinking. He knew it was introducing the public to climbing, but it had all been free solo. He wanted to show the other side of things as well, the partnership, the camaraderie, the teamwork. Nowhere better to do that than on the soaring blue limestone walls of the Verdon. Opera Verticale opens with a close-up of a tanned six-pack as LeBlanc is sitting in the grass, stretching, limestone walls rising just behind him. He is, of course, shirtless with short shorts and a red headband tied kung fu style around his head. He's slacklining, he's going up and down a backer ladder. It's all about him. To this point, we haven't yet seen the magnitude of the walls. The audience is no doubt expecting something like they saw before, the smaller walls of Buttes. Then we see the silhouettes of he and his partner walking out of a tunnel into the early morning light of the gorge, and it cuts to the two of them, necks craned, staring up at something big. We watch the two sort gear and begin lacing shoes, and then suddenly it cuts to a massive blue wall, looking down at Edlinger, searching a blank wall for holds and steadily advancing upward. When you get over the dizzying exposure, you spot the belayer, tiny in the bottom right, also hanging way above the ground. 2 minutes into the climbing, Patrick and the filmmaker have a conversation while Patrick is climbing about what the rope is there for. And Patrick lets go, taking a massive whipper. This, to all of those people in theaters, was a whole new thing. It was an explosion. Young men and young women, and so more young men, and so on, flood into climbing. French superstar Arnaud Petit estimated in the mid-90s that 80% of the growth of climbing in France was due to Patrick Edlinger in these films. He was making more money than he ever imagined, in Paris, rubbing shoulders with celebrities and politicians, and admittedly rubbing more than shoulders with female admirers. His star was still rising, though its ascent was about to slow dramatically. In 1981, a young Belgian climber named Arnaud Tequint had climbed 13 Boulevard du Vol at a historic Belgian crag called Frere, making it the third 8A, or 13B, in the world. But France was behind. The top level was still 13A, and the race was on. Several 8As would appear early in the year. 3 Parisian climbers would make contributions. Gilbert Tribou would do Fritz the Cat, Fabrice Guillot with Crépinette, and a 15-year-old Marc Le Ménestrel with Rêve de Papillon. But right there in the race was Patrick Edlinger, climbing Sliding into Wonderland at Buttes. Though it wouldn't come without controversy. For this 25-meter, around 82-foot overhanging route, only 4 bolts were used. Ground falls would have to be risked. And to get around this, Patrick would dial the route on top rope before leading it. So was it bold? Or was it the opposite? Top roping didn't seem much different than the popular yo-yo ascent, and hang-dogging was being readily welcomed. So, did going ground up even matter anymore? He'd still done the route regardless of the tactics. It all seemed so confusing and cloudy. Not at all like the simple game that he had grown to love. Amongst much debate about the style, Marc Le Ménestrel would make the second ascent, and then famously, Jerry Moffat would back off of an onside attempt, saying simply, "It doesn't make sense." Patrick Edlinger was stuck firmly between worlds. The old, bold ethics versus the new, better protected focus on difficulty. His spot at the top versus being clearly upstaged by a teenager. The glitter of Paris or the comfort of his van, his fame or his freedom. It was this race to 8A where we see the first real rumblings of a rift between Edlinger and the young, upcoming Parisian climbers. They were just as strong, just as good, but nowhere near as famous. And the Parisians had taken to calling Edlinger God, a name that didn't sit well with him. And to make matters worse, it was Le Ménestrel's route, Rêve des Papillons, that would garner the attention he hoped his route would get. But his adherence to his ideals doomed the route to nearly immediate obscurity. He wondered if his star was fading. Yes, the Parisians were jealous of the fame. Of course they were. But Edlinger was growing resentful of the experience that the tight-knit band of climbers from Paris were having. That spring, from May 18th to May 30th, the French Federation of Mountaineering sponsored a worldwide meeting for climbers, centered around the small, powerful cliffs of Sassois in the north and the soaring walls of the Verdon in the south. This would be a chance to share new tactics and ideas, a chance to build camaraderie and community, to establish a new direction. 34 climbers from 12 countries assembled: Ron Fawcett, Kim Kerrigan, Wolfgang Gulich, Catherine Destavel, and of course, Le Blond himself. At Sassois, where many of the best climbers of the day are trying the now famous 7C Plus Chimpanzédrome, with very few successes, Edlinger is nowhere to be found. He's purposely avoiding the fray so as not to see the beta, planning to on-site the route in front of the adoring crowd. He is, after all, one of the best on-site climbers in the world. His time arrives, and the confident Edlinger steps beneath the gray wave of limestone that had, most of the day, repelled its suitors. He looked up at the 1 and 2 finger pockets, weaving an intricate sequence through the 2 bulges, aware that the growing crowd was eagerly awaiting the performance of the most famous climber in the world. "When I'm climbing rock," he'd said in a 1981 interview with French counterculture magazine Actuel, "it's like I'm talking to it. I'm courting it. There's respect in the way I use the holds. It's quiet. You're alone. No one needs anything from me. I don't ask anything of anyone." This time, though, something was different. The eyes on him felt heavy, pushing down on his shoulders, blocking the breeze that he so many times had felt lift him upward. This was his country. This was his sport, his lifestyle. This was his moment. He dipped into his chalk bag, taking care to coat the backs and sides of the fingers. Closing his eyes and taking a breath, he pulled on. But if he was talking to the rock, it wasn't talking back. By the second bolt, he knew that the sequence he'd chosen wasn't quite right. He could feel the weight of his own expectations tugging him back toward the ground. And then he was off. Patrick Edlinger, who would soon be called Adventurer of the Year by Paris Match magazine, promptly lowers, unties, and disappears from Sassois. Look, I make my living as a climbing coach, but I'll be the first to tell you that ever since climbers first decided they wanted to get better, there's been one best way to improve: climb intentionally. So if you can do your climbing on terrain that was built specifically for that, it's a cheat code. And when it comes to this, there's one training board out there that stands above the rest: the Tension Board 2. Here's why. It was designed by people who actually train on boards. With mastery in mind, every decision made with purpose, and over 15,000 climbs in the database and growing, it's not even a question. On all levels, the TB2 is the final boss of training boards. The mix of wood and plastic allows for skin-friendly tiny grips as well as bigger, slopier, open-handed compression climbing. And there are 4 different board sizes to choose from, so whether you run a gym or built yourself a training shed, they've got one for you. And they also make, right here in the USA, a whole suite of premium training and performance goods. And you can get many of those for 15% off if you use the code WRITTEN15. Tension climbing. Mastery over success. The tragic story of the rock star, the actual musical rock and roll star that is, has played itself out over and over again. A young person finds a thing they love and gets very good at it. They're gradually, or not so gradually, recognized by the world for their gifts and are lavished with praise, money, and fame. And they buy into this, taking a seat on a self-declared throne. But from way up there, they lose sight of the culture that they were so entrenched in, the culture that helped build them. And it moves on without them. There are better singers and players coming, ones that may not have the good looks and media presence, but who do have the deep respect of that culture. And it moves faster and faster until it no longer even resembles the same game. The rock star looks down with disdain, vowing a return that never materializes. The high perch on that throne is precarious, and the fall often fatal. Just to the right of Schimpanzedrome, there lies a vicious project, short and bouldery with sloping pockets that's been tried by many of the best climbers. It finally succumbs to the efforts of the talented teenager Marc Le Ménestrel. He calls it Le Bidule, which translates to something akin to the strange machine or the contraption. It's the first 8A+, or 13C, in France, and it's repeated the very next day by Marc's older brother Antoine, and 2 days later by Gilbert Tribut. The Parisians are asserting their dominance, and the perch on that throne grows more precarious. There aren't many climbers in the world as strong as this crew from Paris, but one of those who might be even better is a confident and cocky Brit named Jerry Moffat. And Moffat and his young mentee Ben Moon show up at Sassois, where Jerry would quickly make the first non-French ascent of the new hardest route in the country, Les Bidules. Meanwhile, Moon was projecting Schimpanzedrome, and Moffat watched closely as he worked out the moves, eventually sending his first 7C+. The following Sunday was Jerry's 21st birthday, and he had a gift in mind for himself. A flash attempt of the famous Schimpanzedrome. A route of this grade had never been flashed. But that made Jerry all the more confident. In his book, Revelations, written with Niall Grimes, he says, "Sunday climbers had arrived from Paris, and the normally deserted crag looked like a different place. The French were immaculate, with beautiful matching tops and bottoms, hair coiffed, perfect suntans, and toweling headbands. Their carabiners all matched. They were also clean. We mingled with the Parisians like two dogs. Ben, with his pasty white skin, looked about 15. His long black hair was starting to mat into dreadlocks. His clothes were filthy. I too had scruffy clothes, holes in my trousers, my hair dyed into black and red patches, punk style. We went over to our cave and got our gear on, and I warmed up by doing a 7B overhang, first go, which attracted some attention from the French. They watched us go over to Schimpanzedrome. At the time, I always climbed in my lucky Swami belt, a simple ribbon of webbing with no leg loops to keep myself light. I tied on to a single rope, 9mm in diameter, and fired the pitch off, first try. I ripped it to bits. Straight after, Ben too went up it once more like a rat up a drain pipe. The French were stunned. We wandered to the sleeping cave, and as we had done everything that we wanted to do, packed our bags. We might as well head south. Au revoir. And head south they did, to the Verdun, where Jerry would one-up himself by on-sighting Pol Pot, a 7C+ from Marc Le Ménestrel, firmly establishing himself as the best on-site climber on the planet. He would then, in 2 tries, finish an old project bolted and tried by Edlinger, Pappy on-site, at 7C+. The pair returned to the UK, having done everything there was to do, and leaving the French climbers in awe. Back at Sessois, both stunned and inspired by what Moffat had done, Gilbert Tribou was preparing for an audacious feat. He wanted to free solo something hard, but not just anything. He set his sights on Chimpanzédrome, the hardest route in the country just a few months ago, and the site of Leblanc's public failure. This would put him in a different league. Except, shortly after he completed the solo, he learned that Marc Le Ménestrel had done the same only a few days earlier. Turns out, many of these Parisians were in a different league. The world of climbing that Patrick Edlinger inhabited was changing. People were pulling ahead. The Parisians were coming south and climbing his projects. Hell, even the British were coming over and doing them. Routes he had failed on had been free soloed. Buchs was gaining in popularity, and routes were getting harder and harder. Where Leblanc had often spoken a mystical sort of way about being alone, only himself and the holds, and even his film about the partnership was one of a sort of spiritual serenity. There were now crowds and boomboxes, loud music, and louder climbers. He withdrew, opting to climb by himself or with only his close friends when nobody else was at the crag. He needed peace. He needed to find himself again. He needed escape. He knew his best years of climbing lay ahead, if only he could find that space. So he and a friend buy plane tickets to fly to America. There, he's still a megastar. The climbing world there hasn't seen his failures. They haven't seen the young punks surpassing him, but most of all, he just wants to climb new things in the quiet. Before the trip, searching for some semblance of his roots, he goes to visit an old friend, a blacksmith who once practiced his craft below the crags at Buchs. Patrick appreciated the blue-collar work. It brought him back to his childhood, to his grandfather, who was an inventor of useful machines, and to his first band of climbing partners. That first time waking up in a hammock high above the Verdun. It reminded him of learning a craft and of discovery, of applying himself and getting lost in his work. Simpler times. The old blacksmith had recently moved his shop to the tiny village of Ségoyer, a commune whose name translates to gypsy. When Patrick arrived, he couldn't help but notice the giant limestone cliffs above the town. Curious, he made the arduous hike to the base of the wall and couldn't believe what he was seeing. Streaked blue and gold limestone out massive overhanging waves, pocketed and perfect, and seemingly stretching on forever. He ran back and forth across the base of the wall, seeing possible lines everywhere. With new life, he returned to town and phoned his friend. "I can't go to the States." He tore up his ticket. "I found a cliff I must explore." While the difficulty at Buchs rose higher and higher and the music grew louder and louder, Patrick Edlinger would spend the next 4 years here, bolting routes and learning the ways of this massive limestone paradise. The name of this cliff? Seus.
1, 2.
Written in Stone is produced by me, Chris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush for Plugtone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. Don't worry, there's more to come from Patrick Edlinger later this season as we get deeper into the 1980s. And remember, This show is 100% rooted in the facts, but like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. If you love what you're hearing, give us those 5 stars and a glowing review. Join our Patreon, the Secret Stoners Club, and tell everyone you know at the crag, at the gym, hell, even tell people you don't know. And together, we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, one decade at a time. Secret Stoners, we are back. We're back for real. The season is going. If you're new here, welcome. This is the Secret Stoners Club. The first rule of the Secret Stoners Club is that you tell all of your friends about the Secret Stoners Club. This episode was a tough one for me. All of the media about Patrick Edlinger is essentially, it does what we tend to do once a person has passed on. We lionize them. We grow them to this big myth regardless of truth. And that's sort of what this podcast does. But it seemed like in this case, a lot of the myth was built on the idea that we had, the ideal that we had, maybe both, of who Patrick Edlinger was based on the films and how he was portrayed in the bigger media. And even at the time of his death, Edlinger still had this idea of himself, ideal. I'm not using those words correctly, but maybe in this case they're sort of interchangeable. But he had this vision of himself. He was still saying he was going to make a return and he was going to do 9A even shortly before he passed away. And there was a moment in the making of this episode where I was almost calling him an influencer. And I know a lot of you are going to be like, that's not fair at all. And I agree. It's not totally fair. But it's not fair because of our relationship with that word. I don't necessarily think influencers are bad. And I think Patrick Edlinger was an influencer. He was also a great climber, but his impact was more as an influencer on climbing culture, on the way that we move. And I think that's where he really shined. But I couldn't say that he was an influencer in the main meat of this episode because I knew how people would take that. And that's not the message I wanted to get across. And the whole point of this is to get the message across, right? To communicate it in a way that makes sense. So even though I stand on that, I don't think it was the right way to say it. And after doing the interviews I did for this episode, I felt more and more like that was his role. So I had to take another look at it, and I had to really look at his climbing and figure out where to stop this episode. And we're going to talk about him later in the season again. So I had to figure out how to restart that and not make it seem too dark, that I couldn't bring him back. It was complicated. Wow, you guys, this is so fun. It's so fun to be digging back into this history and connecting all of these dots and figuring out how to tell these stories. And I'm so happy that you're here. Totally sidebar here. My new book is out for pre-sales. It's called Adapt, Lessons Learned, Climbing 100 513s. And it's up for pre-sales on the website. You can find that at powercompanyclimbing.com/adapt if you want to get it for Christmas gifts. We can't, however, guarantee that it's going to be shipped by Christmas. We think it will, but can't guarantee that until we're actually shipping it out. And even then, USPS gets to do with it what they want. So no guarantees, but thank you if you're supporting. Thank you for being here. Coming up next week, interviews with one of the historians of French climbing history, as well as one of the major figures in French climbing history. I'm really excited for you all to hear these interviews. It was great fun for me to have these conversations. So I'll see you all next week.